What if the man you feared the most turned out to be the one person you should have respected all along? A nosy neighbor sees a black man moving into the house next door and immediately calls the police. But when they find out who he really is, the whole neighborhood is left speechless. Like the video and subscribe for more content like this. The August sun blazed down on Magnolia Lane, a quiet cul-de-sac in a well-manicured Georgia suburb. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew each other's names, where kids rode their bikes without fear, and where any sign of trouble was quickly sniffed out by the unofficial watchguard, Eleanor Whitman. Perched behind her pristine white curtains, Eleanor sipped her sweet tea and narrowed her eyes at the black SUV pulling into the vacant house next door. The property had been on the market for months, and she had assumed the new owner would be someone familiar, someone she could trust. But the man who stepped out of the driver's seat? He was tall, broad-shouldered, and black. Eleanor's grip tightened around her glass. The way he moved, calm, deliberate, confident, unnerved her. He wasn't wearing a moving company uniform, and he certainly didn't look like the type who belonged in her neighborhood. She knew trouble when she saw it, and this was trouble. She grabbed her phone off the counter, hands trembling as she punched in 3 numbers. 911. What's your emergency? This is Eleanor Whitman. I'm calling about a suspicious man trying to break into a house on Magnolia Lane. He's black, and he's unloading boxes, but he doesn't look like a mover. I think he might be squatting. The dispatcher asked a few routine questions, but Eleanor wasn't listening. She kept her eyes locked on the man as he carried a large duffel bag inside. It was too big for a suitcase. Maybe it was filled with stolen goods. Or worse. We'll send a unit to check it out, the dispatcher finally said. Eleanor hung up and pressed her lips into a thin line. She had done her duty. 10 minutes later, 2 police cruisers rolled onto Magnolia Lane, red and blue lights flashing silently. Officers Carson and Miller stepped out, hands resting near their holsters. Eleanor watched from her porch as they approached the house and knocked. The black man answered the door without hesitation, his expression calm despite the officers standing stiffly before him. "Sir, we received a report about suspicious activity at this residence," Officer Carson said. "Can you provide some ID?" The man let out a small chuckle, not nervous, amused. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather wallet, handing over a driver's license. Carson studied it for a moment, his brows knitting together before his eyes widened. "Wait a second." Carson's gaze shot up. Before he could finish, Officer Miller stiffened, recognition flashing across his face. His entire stance shifted from authoritative to uncertain. Eleanor, still watching from her porch, felt her stomach drop. Something wasn't right. Who was this man? And why did the police suddenly look afraid? Officer Carson cleared his throat, his posture visibly less rigid than before. He handed the ID back to the man, exchanging a quick glance with his partner. "Sir, we, apologize for the confusion," Carson said, his voice suddenly more measured. The man took his ID and tucked it back into his wallet, the faintest hint of amusement still playing on his lips. "No problem, officer. Just moving into my new home." Eleanor's jaw clenched. New home? That couldn't be right. She stormed off her porch, ignoring the heat rising from the pavement. Her sandals slapped against the sidewalk as she approached the scene. "Excuse me," she called, her voice high-pitched with barely contained indignation. "What do you mean, new home?" The officers turned toward her, but it was the man who spoke first. "I mean exactly that," he said, leveling his gaze at her. "I own this house." Eleanor's lips parted, but no words came out. That wasn't possible. The last she'd heard, the property was still pending sale. "There must be some mistake," she finally sputtered. "I saw you carrying a bag, a big one. What's in there?" The man exhaled slowly, clearly trying to maintain his patience. "Clothes," he said simply. "Documents, my laptop. You know, Things people move when they buy a house. Eleanor's cheeks burned, but she wasn't ready to back down. "Well then, what's your name?" she challenged. The officers shot her a warning look, but the man didn't seem fazed. He studied Eleanor for a moment, then folded his arms across his broad chest. "My name," he said evenly, "is Judge Marcus Ellington." Silence crashed over the street like a tidal wave. Eleanor blinked, certain she had misheard him. The officers, however, hadn't. Their demeanor shifted completely. Miller even took a step back. "Sir," Carson said, voice filled with new respect, "Judge Ellington, I had no idea." "Of course you didn't," Marcus cut in smoothly. "That's the thing about assumptions, isn't it?" Eleanor's knees felt weak. The name, Judge Marcus Ellington, wasn't just familiar. It was famous. She had seen it on the news. He was one of the youngest federal judges in the country, known for his sharp legal mind and relentless pursuit of justice, and she had called the cops on him for moving into his own home. Marcus turned back to the officers. "If we're done here, I'd like to finish unpacking." Carson nodded quickly. "Of course, sir. Again, we apologize for the misunderstanding." Eleanor's mouth opened and closed, struggling to find a way to save face, but Marcus was already heading back inside, leaving her standing there with nothing but humiliation curling in her gut. As the officers returned to their cruisers and drove off, Eleanor realized something with a sinking feeling. She had just made an enemy of the most powerful man in town. Eleanor stood frozen on the sidewalk, watching Judge Marcus Ellington disappear into his house. The front door shut with a firm click, sealing off any chance of a follow-up confrontation. Her hands trembled at her sides. She had just accused a federal judge of being a criminal. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt powerless in her own neighborhood. She was used to being the one people listened to, the one who maintained order on Magnolia Lane. But now, she had made a fool of herself. Worse, she had offended the wrong man. She turned on her heel and hurried back inside, slamming her own door behind her. 2 hours later, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table staring at her phone. The group chat for the neighborhood association had exploded with messages. Susan Barlow. "Oh my God, a judge?" Mike Thompson. "Well, this is awkward." Pamela Green. "I can't believe you called the cops on a federal judge, Eleanor. What were you thinking?" Eleanor scowled and set her phone down. She hadn't been thinking. That was the problem. Her reputation was tarnished. She needed to fix this. Taking a deep breath, Eleanor smoothed her floral blouse, squared her shoulders, and walked out her front door. She would apologize, make things right, and ensure that this whole incident was put behind them. She stepped up to Marcus's porch and hesitated before knocking. The house still smelled faintly of fresh paint, the landscaping neat but new, proof that the place had been recently renovated. The door swung open. Marcus stood there, arms crossed, his sharp eyes studying her with undisguised amusement. He had changed into a crisp polo shirt and dark slacks, looking every bit the distinguished man she had so badly underestimated. "Mrs. Whitman," he said smoothly, "what can I do for you?" Eleanor swallowed her pride. I came to apologize," she said, clasping her hands in front of her. "I made an assumption earlier, and it was wrong. I should have—" Marcus held up a hand, cutting her off. "Let me guess. You should have minded your own business?" Heat crept up Eleanor's neck. "Tell me, Mrs. Whitman," Marcus continued, his voice calm but firm. "Did you call the cops when Mike Thompson had a moving truck outside his house last year?" Eleanor's mouth opened, but no words came. "Or when Susan Barlow's nephew, who, by the way, has a criminal record, stayed with her for a month?" Eleanor stiffened. She had never suspected Susan's nephew of anything, though she vaguely recalled him looking a little rough around the edges. Marcus gave a small, knowing smile. "I thought so." Eleanor's stomach churned. He wasn't just a judge. He was a man who saw straight through people. She tried again, but Marcus only nodded politely. "Apology accepted," he said. "Now if you'll excuse me, I have a home to settle into." Then he shut the door in her face. Eleanor stood motionless on the porch, Marcus's words settling into her bones like a winter chill. Her apology had been dismissed as easily as she had dismissed him earlier that day. She turned stiffly and walked back to her house, her mind racing. The entire neighborhood was watching this unfold. They had already judged her for calling the police, and now they would never let her live it down. The thought made her skin prickle. She had to regain control of the situation. By the next morning, Eleanor had formed a plan. She would smooth things over, not just for herself, but for the good of the neighborhood. If Judge Ellington was going to live here, they needed to establish some kind of mutual respect. She spent the afternoon preparing her best peach cobbler, the one that had won second place at the county fair 3 years ago. No one could resist her baking. By early evening, she was back at Marcus's doorstep, cobbler in hand, rehearsing her words. Be warm, be welcoming, show him that this neighborhood is friendly. She knocked. This time, when Marcus opened the door, he looked genuinely surprised to see her. His expression flickered between amusement and mild irritation. Eleanor mustered a smile. "Judge Ellington," she said sweetly, lifting the dish slightly. "I thought I'd bring over a little welcome gift, Southern hospitality and all." Marcus stared at the cobbler for a long moment before stepping aside. "Come in." Eleanor hadn't expected him to invite her in, but she recovered quickly. She stepped inside, her eyes scanning the house. It was beautiful, modern yet warm. The hardwood floors gleamed, and the open-concept kitchen was stunning. Marcus gestured toward the kitchen island. "You can set that down there." Eleanor placed the cobbler down carefully. "I just wanted to extend a proper welcome," she said, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "I know we got off on the wrong foot, but Magnolia Lane is a wonderful place to live. We like to look out for each other." Marcus leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "Is that what you were doing yesterday?" Eleanor's fingers twitched. "I made a mistake," she admitted, forcing herself to hold his gaze. "And I truly am sorry. But I want to make it right." Marcus exhaled through his nose, considering her. Then, to her surprise, he smirked. "This smells good," he admitted, nodding toward the cobbler. Eleanor brightened. "It's my specialty." Marcus grabbed a couple of plates, scooped out a portion for himself, and took a bite. His eyebrows lifted slightly in approval. Eleanor felt a surge of relief. For the first time, the tension between them thawed, just a little. But just as she was about to seize the moment, there was a sudden, sharp knock at the door. Marcus frowned, set his plate down, and moved toward the door. When he opened it, his entire posture stiffened. 2 police officers stood on his porch. Eleanor's stomach dropped. "What now?" Marcus muttered under his breath. Eleanor's breath hitched. The 2 officers stood firm, their expressions unreadable. One, a broad-shouldered man with a graying mustache, adjusted his belt as he looked past Marcus and directly at Eleanor. "Ma'am, we got a call about a disturbance at this residence," he said, his voice measured but firm. Marcus's jaw clenched. "A disturbance?" he repeated, his tone edged with irritation. "I'm standing here, eating cobbler." The younger officer, a lanky man barely in his late 20s, cleared his throat. "Sir, do you mind if we step inside?" Marcus didn't move. "Actually, I do mind," he said coolly, "unless you have a warrant." Eleanor could feel the tension crackling in the air. The older officer's eyes flicked back to her. "Mrs. Whitman, are you all right?" Her throat went dry. Someone had called the police on her this time. The irony twisted in her stomach like a cruel joke. She started, her voice weaker than she wanted. She swallowed and tried again. "I'm fine. There's no disturbance here." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. "We still need to check things out, ma'am. The caller claimed they heard a woman screaming. Eleanor's brow furrowed. That's ridiculous. I wasn't screaming. She stopped abruptly, realization slamming into her. This was retaliation. Someone in the neighborhood had done this to her. Marcus seemed to come to the same conclusion. His lips pressed into a thin line before he exhaled sharply. "Let them in, Mrs. Whitman," he said, stepping aside. "Let them see for themselves." Eleanor hesitated but nodded. The officers stepped in, scanning the space. Their eyes landed on the plates of cobbler on the kitchen island, the neat arrangement of furniture, the clear lack of any sign of distress. The younger officer rubbed the back of his neck. "Well, nothing seems out of place." Marcus folded his arms. "No kidding." The older officer sighed, glancing back at Eleanor. "We'll file this as a false report, but Mrs. Whitman, if you ever feel unsafe—" "I don't," she said firmly, surprising even herself, "and I don't appreciate being dragged into whatever this is." The officers exchanged a glance before nodding. "All right," the older one said, adjusting his belt again. "Have a good evening, folks." They turned and left, closing the door behind them. Silence settled over the room. Eleanor let out a shaky breath. "I can't believe this," she murmured. Marcus watched her carefully. "Looks like someone decided to give you a taste of your own medicine," he said, his voice unreadable. Eleanor flinched, but she didn't argue. Because he was right. The realization hit her hard. For years, she had thought she was just protecting the neighborhood. But now, she knew exactly how it felt to be on the receiving end of suspicion. And it didn't feel good at all. Eleanor stood frozen, her mind racing. Someone had deliberately called the police on her while she was in his house. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a message. She turned toward Marcus, who was still watching her, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "I swear," she said, shaking her head, "I had nothing to do with this." Marcus didn't say anything at first. Then, with a slow nod, he replied, "I believe you." Relief flooded through her, but it was quickly replaced by a new, uncomfortable feeling. Guilt. She had spent years assuming the worst about people like Marcus. She had been the one making calls, whispering warnings to neighbors, convincing herself it was for the greater good. But now? Now she was the outsider. Marcus sighed and ran a hand over his face. "Welcome to my world, Mrs. Whitman." Eleanor opened her mouth, then closed it. There was nothing she could say that wouldn't sound hollow. A long, heavy silence stretched between them before Marcus finally turned away. "I appreciate the cobbler," he said, voice quieter now, "but I think we're done here." Eleanor hesitated, then gave a small nod. "I understand." She picked up her purse, smoothed the front of her blouse, and walked out the door. 2 days later, the whispers had started before Eleanor even left Marcus's house that night. By the next morning, she could feel the shift in the air. At the grocery store, Mrs. Caldwell, who had always been so chatty, barely acknowledged her. At the post office, Mr. Dunlap gave her a tight-lipped nod before quickly looking away. And at the morning HOA meeting, her usual seat next to the president was already taken. Eleanor wasn't stupid. She knew what was happening. She was being iced out. The irony wasn't lost on her. For years, she had been one of them, part of the tight-knit circle that kept Magnolia Lane exactly the way they liked it. Now, they were treating her like an outsider just because she had been seen walking into Judge Ellington's house. She could have fought it, could have pretended nothing was wrong, forced her way back into conversations, doubled down on her old ways, but instead, she found herself thinking about Marcus, about the look on his face when the police arrived, about the years of suspicion he must have endured, about the fact that in just 2 days she had gotten a tiny taste of what it was like to be him, and it was unbearable. So that afternoon, instead of wallowing, Eleanor baked another cobbler. And this time, when she walked up to Marcus's door, she didn't do it out of obligation. She did it because, for the first time, She actually wanted to know him. When he opened the door, his eyebrows lifted in surprise. "I owe you more than an apology," Eleanor said simply, lifting the dish. "I owe you a conversation." Marcus studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, he stepped aside. "Come on in." Eleanor stepped inside, her fingers tightening around the warm dish in her hands. The last time she had been in this house, the air had been tense, thick with suspicion, assumptions, and unspoken words. Now, there was something different in the way Marcus looked at her, cautious curiosity. He led her into the kitchen, gesturing toward the same stool she had sat on 2 nights ago. She placed the cobbler down on the counter as he grabbed 2 plates from the cabinet. "I wasn't expecting company," he said, slicing into the dessert, "but I won't turn down homemade cobbler." Eleanor forced a small smile. "Well, at least I know I can get one thing right." Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he handed her a plate and took a seat across from her. For a moment, they ate in silence. Then Eleanor exhaled deeply. "I owe you an explanation," she admitted. Marcus gave her a slow, measured look. "Go on." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I never thought of myself as a bad person. I thought I was looking out for the neighborhood. I thought—" She sighed. "I thought I was helping." Marcus set his fork down. "Helping who?" Eleanor swallowed hard. "People like me." His expression didn't change, but the air between them felt charged. "And people like me?" he asked. She dropped her gaze, ashamed. "I was wrong," she admitted. "I was so wrong." Marcus leaned back slightly, studying her. "You've lived here for years, Mrs. Whitman. What changed?" She lifted her eyes to meet his. "You did." Marcus raised an eyebrow. She continued, her voice steadier now. "I spent my whole life believing I was doing the right thing. But then I saw your face when the police showed up. I saw what it's like to be on the other side of that call, and for the first time I understood that maybe—" She paused, shaking her head. "No, not maybe. I was part of the problem." Marcus let out a slow breath, nodding slightly. "That's a start." Eleanor's lips twitched into a sad smile. "It's not enough, though, is it?" "No," he admitted. "But it's something." Silence stretched between them again, but this time it wasn't heavy with tension. It felt like something new, like understanding. Finally, Marcus picked up his fork again. "So, tell me, Mrs. Whitman, what exactly do you plan to do with this newfound perspective of yours?" Eleanor thought for a moment before answering. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but I'd like to start by being a better neighbor." Marcus gave a slow nod. "All right then," he said, taking another bite of cobbler. "Let's see if you mean it." And just like that, something shifted between them. Not a friendship. Not yet. 5 weeks later. Eleanor had always been a woman of routine. Wake up, tend to her garden, attend HOA meetings, and share polite small talk with neighbors who looked and thought like her. But since that night at Marcus's house, everything had changed. She no longer cared about the HOA's approval, or their whispered disapproval. She no longer avoided Marcus's house like the others did. Instead, she made a point to wave when she saw him, exchange greetings when he was outside, and, on occasion, drop by with something fresh from her kitchen. And Marcus? He was still cautious, still watchful, but he no longer shut her out. They had fallen into an easy rhythm of short but meaningful conversations. Nothing too deep, small talk about the neighborhood, the weather, the best places in town to get good barbecue. And yet, it meant everything. One crisp morning, as Eleanor watered her azaleas, she noticed Marcus hauling a large wooden crate from his truck. It was labeled in bold black letters, "Fragile." Curious, she set down her watering can and walked over. "Need a hand?" Marcus chuckled. "I appreciate the offer, but I think I can handle it." Eleanor eyed the crate. "What's in there?" He hesitated before finally answering. A portrait. Her brows lifted. A portrait? Marcus nodded. Of my grandfather. Something in his tone made Eleanor pause. Was he someone important? For the first time, Marcus's expression softened. He was the first black judge in this county, served for over 20 years. Eleanor's breath hitched. The first black judge. Suddenly, it all made sense. The house, the name Ellington, the stares, the whispers, the resentment. This wasn't just any house. It was the home of a man who had changed history, a man that the town had long tried to forget. And Marcus, he wasn't just some new neighbor. He was his grandson. Eleanor looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time. That's why you came back here, she said softly. Marcus nodded. My grandfather built this home. He fought for his place in this town, and I'll be damned if I let anyone erase that. Eleanor swallowed the lump in her throat. For years, she had been a part of that erasure, but not anymore. She took a deep breath, then lifted her chin. Well, she said, I'd love to see that portrait once it's up. Marcus studied her for a long moment, then gave her a small, knowing smile. I'll hold you to that, Mrs. Whitman. And for the first time since Marcus moved in, Eleanor realized something. She wasn't just trying to be a better neighbor anymore. She was learning to be a better person, and maybe, just maybe, she wasn't doing it alone. But maybe, just maybe, the beginning of one. Eleanor thought she was protecting her neighborhood, but all she was doing was protecting her biases. Sometimes, the people we fear the most are the ones we need to understand. When you let go of assumptions and truly listen, you might realize the biggest change needs to happen within yourself. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on post notifications to be the first to know when the next story drops.